Yeah, well, just want to say thank you, Miguel, Oilfield Witness. It's really an honor to be speaking in front of this group. So I'm just going to present a little bit of what I have learned. And much of this material has come from workers, a lot in the Marcellus, which is where I've spent most of the time. And part of what I'm doing out here in the Permian is to determine, where are things maybe going wrong and putting workers and communities at risk. So I'll just do a little bit of a history or lesson on radium, radioactive element that can be elevated in produced water, right? So the industry calls it brine. They call it produced water. Out here, they just call it salt water. But salt water, brine, produced water can have benzene, all sorts of volatile organics, can have elevated levels of heavy metals like lead, arsenic. If you're talking about flowback, there can also be fracking chemicals that return back to the surface. We have, really difficult stories, tragic stories of workers in the Marcellus cleaning out tanks, up to their knees in flowback, and then later got rashes exactly up to that point. One gentleman in particular, who my book is dedicated to, Randy Moyer, he was a brine hauler, developed these strange protrusions, like swellings all over his body. They couldn't figure out what was wrong. He went to the doctor. They said he ate bad Chinese food. It was almost like a sick joke, him trying to get help and just being ignored. And he had kids, and eventually he passed away. One of 9 people that the book is dedicated to, all people who passed away during the course of my reporting. So it's real, these risks, but the element that I tend to focus on is radium, right? So radium is just a radioactive metal. Lead is a heavy metal, arsenic is a heavy metal, radium is a radioactive heavy metal, and the EPA has limits for radium. So there's a drinking water limit. We do not want people drinking radioactive metals. And the limit for water is 5, and the unit is picocuries per liter. So like that. And that's the drinking water limit. And then there's a limit at which we can actually define a fluid, a liquid, as, quote, radioactive waste. And this ends up being a really important question. What is radioactive waste? We don't want radioactive waste. For radium, you don't need that much of it for EPA to define it as radioactive waste. And it's 60. So 60 picocuries per liter. Now, in the Marcellus, radium levels in the brine, produced water, to me are very deceptive words because, again, worker or a first responder showing up when a truck crashes, and the brine trucks in the Marcellus crash regularly because out here it's big open plains, but in the Marcellus you've got steep hills and hollers, and it's amazing being out here because some of this area is, you go a while without seeing a lot of people, big ranches, industrialized zones. There you've got little farming communities with cows and brine trucks coming down these curves. They flip over, firefighters show up, and they think, brine, what is this? Salt water. So brine in the Marcellus, radium can average 9,330 picocuries per liter and be as high as 28,500. So we're so far above this limit at which we can define something as radioactive waste. So that means these trucks technically are carrying radioactive waste. And where's the eraser? Because I'll just start fresh. So, perfect. So for the, now we actually don't have that much data for the Permian, which is really worrisome to me because we don't know what guys are getting involved with. We know for the Bakken, levels average about 3,600 picocuries per liter. That's Bakken average, and Bakken high point is like 6,500, right? There's very little data for the Permian, which to me is crazy. And this goes back to the Railroad Commission. I've asked them this question. They just don't have data. But worker safety is connected to having this data. One study was done 2 years ago at a scientist in New Mexico, and they found radium in the range of like 900 to 1250 picocuries per liter. So it's a lot lower than the Bakken, than the Marcellus. It's still above that 60 threshold at which we can call it, quote, radioactive waste. But my concern with this is one pinpoint in a huge, complicated oil field. And this is why it matters. And this is really where it brushes up against workers' skin and brushes up against workers' families, is because you've got a brine truck, right? And you've got a brine tank maybe at the wellhead, and you'll have a little bit of sludge that will form in the bottom. Brine has a lot of sediment. It has suspended solids, and so these metals are heavy, they go to the bottom, and you've got a sludge that forms. I always use the example of a cup of coffee. You have a good coffee, it's really thick with sediment, you let it sit for a little bit, you've got stuff on the bottom, a little bit of, like a little skein of sludge. So this sludge, you imagine, it's gonna have even more concentrated levels of all of the contaminants, including the radioactive contaminants. And these right here are EPA's own numbers. We're talking about not just radium now, but the decay products of radium. Radium is a radioactive element, so it does what radioactive elements do. It blasts off radiation, decays to other elements, which are also radioactive. So you have radioactive isotopes of lead, polonium, which is what the Russians used to poison Alexander Litvinenko. It's a famous case. They put like less than a grain of sand in his tea at a fancy hotel bar, and the dude died an absolutely terrible death. So these are dangerous radioactive elements, and in the sludge you can have like 27,000 picocuries per gram. Average on Earth in the soil, natural lead and polonium in soil would be like 1 picocurie per gram. So you're way, way above average. That's a high point. But the problem is, and I'm talking to guys in Permian, in Eagleford, as we're out here, if it's not done right, and it's often unfortunately not done right, someone would be going into these tanks. With a brine truck, there's a little back in the Marcellus, they call it a clamshell, the little back part, you open it up and you pop in, and they're crawling around in that sludge. And then you're literally in an enclosed space. If you don't have PPE, and often they don't, you're breathing in materials, and you can get your clothing and also your body soaked. You could take those clothes home to your family, literally washed in the family washing machine. I'm just going to read, this is, and there's industry reports on this, which stuns a lot of people, but this is from the early 90s, norm contamination in the petroleum industry, really, really important document by an Oklahoma industry consultant, and this is why it becomes such a risk for the workers. I'm just going to read this one line. These radioactive heavy metal decay products may attach to dust particles and aerosols to become part of the sludge. So that ends up being a really significant thing. Are you breathing in materials? And it's simple. Again, it's a simple worker issues. I mean, you don't have to spend much to give guys the right PPE, and some of the companies have it, but if you don't, it can be a really significant exposure. So now we jump to the facilities that I've reported on in the Marcellus, which are called treatment facilities, and that's a good thing. They don't want to do injection. They're trying to treat the waste. And the problem, though, is it's really complicated. And if you're not spending the right money to do that right, you can put guys. So we have a facility in northern West Virginia called Fairmont Brine, and they were very excited. They're trying to pull salts out of it for road salts, maybe even pull lithium. And it's like this big plant up on a hill in this town called Fairmont, just outside the town, and there's big structures, there's a big pond, there's a big parking lot here. I came across this site because a tank had exploded, the place was abandoned, and I went there with Dr. Yuri Gorby, who was just here in the Permian, and we found the place literally smothered with radioactive sediment, radioactive sludge from the process. They couldn't remove all the contaminants, and you're kind of stuck with this logical problem, right? Even if you can successfully remove the contaminants, and I heard Hawk talking about this just the other day, even if you can successfully remove the contaminants, well, guess what? You've just concentrated them, right? So now you've got a new problem, because what are you going to do with that stuff? It's great you got them out, but now you got it up sitting in frac tanks or vac trucks, And so those things get left on site. And in this case, it just got splattered all around the site. And it looked like dirt. And we took readings and radium levels 5,072 picocuries per gram. So we're in grams, not liter. But again, on average, soil on Earth is like 1. So you're like 5,000 times above average. At 5 picocuries per gram, EPA would require a Superfund site to be cleaned up. So we're at like 1,000 times the Superfund limits. What's concerning about this site is we found out, I mean, you didn't have to find out. It's covered with graffiti, beer bottles, mattresses, like kids were partying there. They had actually come there to hang out. You're sitting in the city, it's very pretty. You got this nice view. And they were hanging out there for like a whole summer, not just one night, having bonfires. And to me, that is an absolute regulatory failure. Not only that, the workers are put at risk too. And when I finally got connected to them, I learned that 2 workers from this plant had passed away from cancer. One brain cancer, and I'm in touch with his widow still, with her earlier on the trip, and a stomach cancer. They were in, you remember this line about dust? They described to me in this room where they're trying to take the salt out of the brine, incredibly dusty. They described it as like this haze, and you couldn't even see, and no PPE. And they were not informed, so they would eat right up in the control room. It's just a horrible exposure, continuous day in, out, 16-hour days. So what I've seen there is that these risks are real, and it doesn't just fall on the workers, it also, if you really mess it up, it can literally fall on the kids in the community. And the last thing I'll mention is that it ends up affecting truck drivers too, right? Because the guys who are driving around, and I'm leading into Billy here, guys who are driving around trucks, or girls driving around trucks, they are holding a material that, according to the letter of the law, has been defined as non-hazardous, right? So that affects a lot of things. For one, it affects their pay. They're not being paid to haul hazmat, they're being paid to haul non-hazmat. Just, you know, general, it could be general trash. It is a material, though, that can be quite hazardous. Radioactivity, lead, arsenic, benzene, all these things are legitimately, by the laws of science, hazardous, and yet it's been defined as non-hazardous. And then there's also an issue of insurance. You know, they're not insured for hazmat. And then, of course, there's a worker safety issue. And this all goes back, why is it non-hazardous? It goes back to an exemption that the industry received in the late 1970s, called the Benson and Bevel Amendments exemption. So I'll stop it there. But I think what I've learned is that there is a legitimate concern for especially the workers who end up getting really intimately in contact with this material. So guys, maybe not the guy driving the truck, but the guy who goes inside the truck to clean it out, absolutely that's a risk. And when I hear about these treatment facilities being set up, and that's a big trend right now, you know, my question is always, A, how are you gonna treat it? And B, what are you gonna do with the stuff you pull from the waste? And I haven't had a company who's been able to honestly answer that question for me. You know, usually when I ask them, we did this the other day, called the company, and they just can't wait to get off the phone with me. So I'm not convinced that they're handling it right. But yeah, thank you all so much for your time and attention.
What is proper regulation look like?
So, I mean, if you talk to people who work in the nuclear industry and you tell them the levels being reported in the oil and gas industry, they're just completely appalled. They have a much more thorough system, and it's not designed, it's designed to protect the workers. I mean, that's why it's there. So for example, you would never be able to just walk on site with levels this high. You have contamination zones, you have decontamination zones. You can't eat and drink in the workspace, and certainly workers are going to be given minimal PPE, which in many cases is you know, a mask, which costs a couple dollars. So there's just more protection for the workers and better pay. The pay in the nuclear industry is higher, and the idea is like you are taking on greater risk and you get greater pay for that. You know, that's the little contract there, is everything. Yeah. Yeah, so good question. Radium has a half-life of 1,600 years. So when you have a site contaminated with radium, it's contaminated for generations. And cleaning it up is very hard. What's in trouble there is there's only a couple spots in the U.S. that can take low-level radioactive waste. And you're out in West Virginia, the spots that can take it are out west. It's very expensive to haul heavy stuff long distances, so they're having trouble getting rid of it. And it's still just stuck there on site. But yeah, it's a good point. The contamination lasts. And in Oklahoma, there's a situation, and I think we were also, discussing this too the other day with Hawk, is that if you build on an old oil field and you have some of that contamination, something like benzene will eventually, break down, but radium doesn't. And so that contamination can linger for quite a while. Yeah. Yeah, well then, yeah, and you can follow it. And there's been studies where they follow it, radium in the dust or follow the radium through like river pathways. So a spill into a river. And this happened up on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation in North Dakota. Huge brine spill, 2 million gallons. It's called Bear Den Bay brine spill. You can look it up. They tried to cover it up initially, but some great organizers there pulled the cover. Lisa and DeVille, they wanted to protect our water and earth rights. And their tribal government wouldn't even let them on site, but Lisa and Walter are very well trained. They knew what was up. And eventually they got a scientist from Duke University to test this back years later, and the levels many miles downstream from the spill were still quite good. So, and that reservoir where it spilled right above is in drinking water sources for the tribe. So, yeah, these are, they're real. I appreciate everyone listening, and I'll pass it off to a very special person, Billy Randall.